Bueno, egunon, ongi etorri eta eskerrik asko ekitaldi honetara etortzeagatik. Bilbao Metropolitarra bere etorkizunaren eragile. Hau da, gaurko ekitaldiaren titulua, eta dakizuenez, ekimen hau Bilbao Metropoli-30 elkarteak bultzatzen duen ST3 proiektuaren barruan kokatzen da. Proiektu horren izena, Strategic Trends Think Tank da, eta horren helburua hiri garapen estrategikoari ezagutza duten nazioarteko adituak gure metropolira ekartzea da. El evento de hoy, como decía, se enmarca dentro de la iniciativa ST3, Strategic Trends Think Tank, un proyecto que impulsa Bilbao Metropoli-30 y que tiene como objetivo acercar a nuestra metrópoli el pensamiento más pionero y vanguardista sobre el futuro de las ciudades y de las metrópolis, de la mano de ponentes internacionales como Bruce Katz, que nos acompaña hoy aquí. El título elegido para esta ponencia coloquio, Bilbao Metropolitano, Maker of Its Own Future, nos parece que es interesante y sugerente al mismo tiempo, y para darnos la visión de cómo nuestra metrópoli puede afrontar los retos de futuro a los que nos enfrentamos, contamos hoy con la inestimable participación de Bruce Katz, asesor de políticas públicas de renombre internacional, eta Bilbao Metropoli-30 oso zoriontsuak gara gaur Bruce Katz gurekin dagoelako. Entzuten duzu, Bruce? Hoi entzuten duzu, parkatu. Do you get the translation?
It's okay.
Voy a presentar muy brevemente a Bruce porque creo que tenéis su currículum y además corremos el riesgo de utilizar casi todo el tiempo que tenemos previsto para su presentación haciendo su presentación, y además él comentaba ayer que cuando hay presentaciones muy largas le da la sensación de que la persona a la que se presenta está fallecida. Entonces, como nos queremos alejar por completo de esa perspectiva, voy a rescatar solamente 2 o 3 pinceladas de su trayectoria profesional. Él ha tenido una representación importante en la Brookings Institution, fue vicepresidente y además fue fundador del Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Además ha codirigido el equipo de vivienda y transición urbana de la Administración Obama, pero también colaboró en las administraciones de Clinton y más recientemente de Biden. Es visiting professor de la London School of Economics, premio Heinz Award en Public Policy y coautor de varias publicaciones, entre las que se encuentra la última, The New Localism, de la que vamos a hablar hoy. Antes de comenzar el coloquio, tenéis sobre la mesa unos tarjetones con unos bolígrafos para que, si queréis hacer alguna pregunta a Bruce a lo largo de la mañana de hoy, pues podéis hacerlo en esos tarjetones y yo me encargaré de trasladarle las preguntas que tengáis. Y sin más dilación, Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you here in Bilbao. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation.
Well, thanks for having. I was having a Monty Python.
Yeah, I see.
Trying to figure it out. But,
Okay, and I think my first question is a must, and is related to this new localism perspective, in which you advocate for cities and metropolis to play a leading role in the challenges we are facing. Can you explain what is your proposal? What is the radical nature of this new localism?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation. This is my first time in Bilbao. It is such a special place. And I've had the best guide in the world to take me around. So thank you all for coming today. In some ways, it's a bit odd for someone who, I was in the federal government, the national government of the United States for 10 years. I worked in the Congress, and then I worked for President Clinton at the housing ministry. But over the last 20, 25 years since I left the federal government, I've become convinced that the real power in the world is really at the local and metropolitan level, because it's at this level where you're able to bring together public sector leaders, corporate, philanthropic, university, et cetera, leaders from all sectors, to try to problem solve together, both around particular issues, let's say traffic congestion or affordable housing or the regeneration of a waterfront, or issues that cut across many themes and many geographies. At the national level, really, I think after the Second World War in the United States, everything has become very specialized. So we have a department for, ministry for housing, and a ministry for transportation, and a ministry for the environment, and everything is kept separate from each other. At the city and metropolitan scale, where we live our lives, all these issues are interconnected. And so if the federal government or national government is a vertical government, cities and metropolitan areas are more horizontal. And they're able to pull together, leaders from different sectors across multiple disciplines. And so new localism really came out of observations that my co-author and I, Jeremy Nowak, had made after decades of working both at the national level, at the state level, and then at the city level. And then I began to do a lot of work outside the United States, which in many respects reinforced my belief that this is the 21st century power. And we have so many issues to solve in the 21st century, but it's at the local level with support from the national government and provincial governments and the private and civic sectors that I think problems get solved.
Okay. And in this challenge of facing these future problems in terms of cities, you always talk about metropolitan areas and regions as networks of trust. In the case of Metropolitan Bilbao, BM30 was born 30 years ago as a consequence of a deep crisis, and we foster public-private cooperation. What is needed now to foster these new instruments of public-private cooperation in cities and regions?
Well, metropolitan areas are really the units of the global economy, the core central city, the municipalities that revolve around the city, and then rural areas at the periphery. And we actually measure metropolitan areas in the United States, I think, a bit different. It's all based on commuter flow. Where do people wake up in the morning and where do they work? And then we track that very carefully in the United States because we're such a sprawled out country that if you wake up in one county and work in another, then you're part of the metropolis. The metropolitan areas are really not governed in the same way as cities or suburban municipalities. We've tried to create entities to help govern them across the public sector, cities and counties and suburban municipalities, rural villages, and then across the public and private. So if you go to any major American metropolitan area, you'll have a metropolitan planning organization where the public sector sits, usually around transportation, maybe workforce. And then you'll have a business or a civic leadership group that also sits at the metropolitan scale, again, because that's the unit of the economy. The most important element is trust between people. I mean, that is the currency by which you solve problems. We think about currency as capital, as money, as resources. But the places that really succeed in the United States, at least, are those places where a business leader is sitting with the head of a university, is sitting with the mayor or someone from a particular ministry, and they're basically problem solving in a collaborative way, either at the city scale or at the metropolitan scale. And trust means that you need to work at relationships. I mean, at the end, this is about people. So we can get very technocratic about all the challenges we face. But when we go back and say, why did metropolitan Denver succeed in the United States? And I asked the mayor, the former mayor of Denver, what was the most important thing that you did to help build the airport or help expand the transit system? He said, I called up the mayor of an adjoining municipality and asked him to breakfast. And we started doing that on a regular basis. So, you know, what we say in the US is if you want trust, bring the donuts and the coffee, and spend the time getting to know each other as people and getting to understand the challenges that face your place and your citizenry. And that becomes the platform for beginning to, you know, put forward solutions that can be embraced politically and by the market.
Trust is a good beginning. Shall we move to money now?
Money. We've got an American in the room. Let's talk about money.
You know, Biscay, our region, has its own tax system, and we've been talking about the benefits of this advantage in that case. Can you give us some information about which are the means of financing urban projects are available? We don't, unfortunately, have philanthropic aids in the Basque Country. It's not very common here. But are there any original or innovative ways of financing metropolitan projects? And can you also talk about those playbooks with huge amounts of money coming to the States for new projects?
Yeah, so when you think about a city or metropolitan area, and you think about the different kinds of projects that when they come together in special geographies really have a transformative effect. I mean, the effect that my former boss, who was the housing minister of the United States, Henry Cisneros, always would say, you want to have a 2 + 2 = 5 effect. You want to have that catalytic effect, that transformative effect. So there's many different kinds of projects, actually. There's the cleaning of the river, you know, the regeneration of the waterfront. We're looking at the Guggenheim Museum here. I mean, spectacular architecture, a cultural asset. There's commercial real estate, there's residential real estate, there's investment in small business, there's investment in innovation, research and development, commercialization. So all these are really different kinds of projects that have different kinds of investment from the public sector, private sector, and the civic sector. We call that the capital stack, you know, and in any transformative project, in the United States at least, there may be a platform of public money, but then there's bank debt, there's maybe private equity investment, there may be philanthropic grants. So it becomes complicated after quite some time. At any given time, you know, our national government or our states may be investing a lot, but only in certain kinds of things. Like right now in the US, they're investing a lot in infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, broadband. From the national level, what they're not investing in, and this is where you have to start really thinking, is affordable housing, or dealing with homelessness, or dealing with the regeneration of waterfronts and corridors, or dealing with skills. And so all those issues are pushed down to the local level and the metropolitan level. And basically the memorandum from the national government is you're in charge, go figure it out. Whether you're in a hot market or a weak market, or a place where the city is large or a place where the city might be small. So that's when you have to start thinking about innovative finance and how to basically build or preserve affordable housing or invest in your small businesses with very little support from the national government or your state governments. So the way we think about this now increasingly is to think about projects first and capital next. So don't start with the capital, because everyone generally says, oh, do we have the resources? Well, the resources for what is the question, right? And so what we've been experimenting with are not just general plans for particular parts of our city or metropolitan area, but investment playbooks, a portfolio of projects They might be commercial real estate, they might be environmental remediation, they might be residential real estate, they might be small business investments, they might be innovation. And each project then has a different kind of capital resourcing that we have to work on. The key is to try to get to some norm, some model that can be repeated again and again and again, a routine that can be repeated, even though you're blending very different kinds of capital. And so I think this is a fascinating period. The one thing that I think we've seized on in the US, and this is from Europe, it's not our invention, is to understand what the public sector owns. And by the public sector, it might be city government, the port authority, an airport, a transportation authority, the water utility, an electric utility. Let's combine and aggregate everything that the public sector owns and think about how we dispose of those assets or keep an interest in those assets. And that becomes a long-term revenue stream. So we've been looking at Copenhagen, we've been looking at Hafen City in Hamburg, what you did along your waterfront here. We're not that smart in the US with what the public sector owns. We tend to just sell it off, without really thinking about the long term. As we say in the US, our sense of the long term is lunch. Your sense of the long term is 75 or 100 years. We literally don't think in those kind of decade-long, but we're trying to now because of climate and so many other issues. So the capital stack and the projects driving the capital is, I think, a different way post-pandemic for the US to really grapple with so many of our challenges, building and stealing, and we like to steal ideas all the time, stealing ideas from Europe that might make sense.
It's surprising for someone coming from the States saying that projects should be first and then money will come. We have the stereotype of we need a vision. We need a vision
Right.
for the city. Are there any inspiring examples of cities in the United States or that you know in the world that have had a vision and have been able to fulfill it?
I think, so this is a really interesting question because there's an exhibit at Grand Central Station in New York City. How many people have been to New York in the audience? So, yes, our wonderful train station in New York. There's an exhibit right now about the Regional Plan Association, which 100 years ago began to plan the physical city and the physical metropolis for New York City. And the person who was the head of it was the cousin of President Roosevelt. So they did quite well in the 1930s. But they've had 4 plans over the course of the last 100 years. And that's probably the best example of a place that has planned its future in the United States. It's our largest city. It's a large portion of our gross domestic product. But when they planned their projects, they didn't know where the money was coming from. Their view was, let's, at this point in time, knowing what we know, do the best we can do, the money will come, whether it's from the public sector or from some public-private financing. I would say increasingly, for most parts of the US, yes, we plan the physical city and the physical metropolis, but we also plan the enterprise city, the innovation city, because of the way in which certain sectors of the economy drive the rest of the economy, our traded sectors, our advanced research universities, our advanced industries. And right now, I would say there's enormous focus on what we call industrial policy, because there's a sense that we may be able to reshore manufacturing and production into the United States because of the effect of the pandemic on supply chains, because of the war in Ukraine, because of our competition with China. So the US wants to make things again. And then again, that's an easy thing for politicians to say, we're going to make things again. Well, you need to have policy, you need to have public investment, you need to have private investment. But I would say that's where a lot of our planning is happening right now. It's, can we bring manufacturing back, particularly in those older industrial parts of our country? You know, think Buffalo, think Pittsburgh, think Cleveland, think Detroit, think St. Louis. And I would say there's a sense now that post-pandemic, the dynamics are different, you know, and we need to adjust and adapt to that. But, you know, we're a country that's fascinated by money and fascinated by technology. It's always about innovation, product innovation, process innovation. So there's quite a bit of bubbling happening right now. There's a lot of sense of optimism because we have all these universities and investors and startups and scale-ups. But the key is to try to push that towards some broader goal. Let's crack the climate problem, or let's deal with the housing crisis. Not just to have lots of little firms begin to bubble up, but let's bend them towards solving big problems in collaboration with the public sector. So I would say the tradition was more physical planning, and now it's economic planning, industrial planning in some respects, which is we haven't really done in a long time. So it's quite interesting to see everyone struggle with this at the local or metropolitan scale. Because the nation can make investments. You know, the Department of Commerce or the National Science Foundation or Department of Defense, they can make lots of investments. They're all determined locally. No one in the federal, the national government is dictating anything. It's what happens in Phoenix or Pittsburgh or Portland. Like, how do they take that money and then put it towards what they're good at? And no one in the national government has a clue what anyone's good at. I mean, it's all locally driven. So it's fascinating to watch how people locally are trying to organize to realize, to be the best version of themselves. And, you know, there's, again, a great quote from Dolly Parton, our country music singer, "Figure out who you are and do it on purpose." In retrospect, she may be the greatest economic development thinker of the 21st century. I mean, you know, because that's literally how we think about economic activity in the U.S. What are you good at, Pittsburgh? Get better at it. What are you good at, Detroit? Auto, electrification. Get better at it. So that's, I think, what's happening right now. It's an exciting time in many ways. It's chaotic. I mean, it's very chaotic right now, I would say, in the U.S. Plus, our politics are completely dysfunctional, so that always helps. But it's a fascinating period.
We will talk about Dolly Parton later. We won't forget about
in fact, we should play some Dolly Parton music, and then we'll be so horrified we'll all leave, but that's okay.
But you've mentioned Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was one of the cities that BM30 study in the beginning, and we have the former director of BM30, Alfonso, here, and he remembers quite well that Pittsburgh was one of the main models for Bilbao, because thanks to the Renaissance process, they were able to transform themselves, and now they are becoming again a global innovation hub in terms of robotics and biomedical industries. How are they implementing this new narrative? How are they pushing these strengths again?
Well, you know, Pittsburgh is a 40-year-old overnight success story. So, I mean, this is the one thing about a place like Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the capital of steel production in the United States. In 1979, the steel industry collapsed in the U.S., literally overnight. And tens of thousands of workers were out of work. And in many parts of the U.S., what would happen is, we got to get those jobs back. So how do we get those jobs back? And then maybe for the next 10 or 20 years, that's the conversation. Pittsburgh moved relatively quickly to say, and this is the universities, the business leadership, some remarkable political leadership, and very large philanthropies that we have in the United States. The Heinz, if you know about the Heinz family and ketchup for our French fries, they have a very large philanthropy. So these folks sat together and said, the jobs are not coming back. All right, we need to move towards the future, not the past. And with state government, city government, they began to invest in next generation industries. They began to take risks, really, because no one knew in 1980 even what robotics was, really. I mean, when you think about the state of technology in 1980, anyone who was talking about a robot future, you would probably think was like Jules Verne. I mean, just like a fiction writer, like they were completely insane. But they began to invest into their major universities, Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, around basic research and development, and then the commercialization of research. And over time, they began to invent products or other processes that began to affect industries all over the United States. So at this point, Pittsburgh is like an it city, I mean, for innovation. I mean, when you go to Pittsburgh and you go into these, what were factories, you'll see drones flying around. I mean, it really feels like some kind of, futuristic place at times in a very old industrial city, but it took 40 years to get there. I mean, it took an enormous amount of patient capital that was basically saying, let's take risk as the public sector, private sector, philanthropic sector together, and let's invent a new future. And you're a sister city to Pittsburgh. The topography feels very similar. The older industrial feel of the place is quite similar. And I think the lesson to take from that is really look towards the future, build on what your distinctive assets are, and stick to it. Just stick to it. And then, the one other thing about Pittsburgh I'll say, which is not well understood at all, is that Pittsburgh became a place, because of their universities, for migration from India. Engineers from India, computer scientists from India. And so there's like a large Indian population in Pittsburgh. We think of Pittsburgh mostly as a white city and a black city, traditional American city. But there was a lot of international migration into Pittsburgh. And over time, that began to give the place access to global markets and a sense of thinking outside the box. So in the US, I mean, we're such a mishmash of cultures and religions and demographics, but that's a healthy thing. And so migration, immigration becomes such a critical part of the story. Again, it comes down to people, really, who continually replenish, your stock, essentially, right? So Pittsburgh's a great story. I love going to Pittsburgh. My favorite Italian restaurant in the entire United States. As you know, I like food, so this is like anytime I get invited to Pittsburgh, I'm there. Okay, but only if that restaurant is open that week. But it's an exciting place. It's a place that was literally devastated by the collapse of the steel industry. I mean, devastated, overnight. But then they crawled back and built a future. And now companies go to Pittsburgh just because they have to be there. It's such an innovative place. Google and Amazon and all the major tech companies, they have to be in Pittsburgh because it's like a secret sauce they have to draw from.
And you've mentioned Carnegie Mellon University, and we are in a university here.
Yeah.
What's the role of universities in terms of this business attraction or this competitiveness towards the outside? What's the role? I mean, I read an interview of yours saying that you need a top-level university and just wait 100 years. We won't be here in 100 years' time, but what are the leading roles that universities can play in the...
So I do think that in the US, universities play such a central role, and that quote came from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a United States senator and was a professor at Harvard. So he was thinking about Harvard, and build a great university and wait a couple hundred years, something's bound to happen. I think now something happens more in 10 years than in that length. He was also, by the way, our ambassador to India, just by coincidence. I think universities play several roles in the United States. Their central role, obviously, is to educate the talented workers of the future. Whether they're lawyers, whether they're engineers, whether they're computer scientists, et cetera. But there is a sense of a civic university role in the US, which is, what's the role you play in your local economy? Can you be a platform for company formation, job growth, and really beginning to work closely with business to understand what are the occupations of the future? What are the factories of the future? What's the work, the office of the future? And how do you prepare people for that? So it's a very tight connection between university and business in the United States. The other thing is our national government. The one thing they do consistently, Republican, Democrat, irrespective, is there's an enormous amount of investment in research and development. Basic science, not as much applied as in Europe, but basic science. And so Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh are two at the top, going back to Pittsburgh in the United States. And again, that's a risk-taking exercise because you really don't know what you're going to invent. Whether it's a cancer-related drug or whether it's, a new kind of material for automobiles or Air Force or whatever. I mean, you don't know what you're going to invent. So this constant flow of research and development related to innovation. So universities are really at the core of our economy in many respects, not just because they educate workers, but because they invent the future. And in many respects, they are the top leaders in their metropolitan economies. They're like the heads of the task forces or the study commissions or whatever they are, and they're like leading the charge to Pittsburgh 2040 or whatever. I mean, we have these all the time in the US. Go out 15 years and there's some major initiative underway. So I would say universities are playing a very different role in the 21st century than they did in the 20th. And then they have alumni who come back constantly, because we have reunions of people, people think about, oh, the time I went to college was the best time in my life. I don't believe that, but that's okay. So we're constantly coming back for reunions, mostly because our universities want to raise money from us. And you feel a commitment to where you went to school. So alumni begin to invest in that economy, even though they're not from there. I mean, it's quite interesting, actually. Yeah.
Hago un inciso para recordaros que podéis hacer preguntas que le podemos dirigir a Bruce y las vamos a ir recogiendo si os parece. Another question related to the downtown attraction effect.
Yeah.
I know the North American model is different from the European one. You've grown towards the periphery, but you mentioned also that downtown spaces are regaining again attraction. I don't know if it is so, or you are in the way of going back to the downtown spaces, like in Europe. What are the actives of those spaces in terms of networking or economic development?
Well, this is a really interesting question for this moment, because I think there was a downtown rebound in the United States over the last 25 years. Because we are a sprawled country, a suburbanizing country. The bulk of our population lives in the suburbs, not in cities. So the last 25 years, there was a rebound in our downtowns, partly around a mix of office, residential, entertainment. Most of our sports stadia came back to the downtown along our riverfronts. Our waterfronts were cleaned up, large amounts of funding for that. The pandemic has actually upended a lot of this because of remote work. And some downtowns are doing quite well, thank you, like Austin, Texas or something. But many downtowns are ghost towns. And last night I took a walk from the Carlton Hotel down to your old town. And the one thing I was just so struck, my God, there's so many people on the street here. You would not find that in most American cities. The downtown would be empty. I mean, literally, it would be like a ghost town. Occasionally you'd see a person off in the distance and then you'd run in the opposite direction. I mean, so I was really struck by the vibrancy and the vitality of this place. So we have to struggle now, I think, post-pandemic, because our companies haven't quite decided, are we bringing people back to the office? Are they coming back 2 days a week, 3 days a week? And then the question becomes, what happens to all those small businesses that were feeding off those downtown workers? What happens to the transit system with all the riders who were coming into downtown? What happens to the tax collection? Because so much of it depends on where you work. Well, everyone's sitting at home in their pajamas. I'm not quite sure that that's going to work for the broader community. So we're in a very odd period right now. I think downtowns are threatened by some of these new dynamics. The parts of our cities that are growing, by the way, are the areas around our universities and hospitals. They're booming because they're like innovation districts. And that's where you see the students are back, the faculty are back. Obviously, your doctor is not going to perform surgery on a Zoom call, so they're back. So those seem to be the places that are vibrant. But the downtowns, I think, are mixed right now. And I think we're going to have a new set of policies and public-private investments, a new vision for our downtowns. Because when I talk to anyone under the age of 30, they don't want to go back to work. It's a generational issue in the US as much as a question of the pandemic. I mean, so employers, employees, we're sort of testing ourselves right now to see what happens. I don't think Europe's the same. I think, you're more of a tradition of, maybe smaller housing. You want to be out. In the US, a lot of our homes are too large, so you're just, take a walk around your house. It's like taking a walk around your downtown, I guess.
It's the new disorder, right? Now, mentioning the strategic projects of the future, we've been talking these days about the estuary, our river, and from our perspective, there's the main axis of the metropolitan area. What could be your views for this future, for this strategic space, or are there any inspiring models of other waterfronts in the United States or in Europe that could be some guidelines to follow for us?
Well, I think the question, I think, for every place is, particularly places with such a remarkable history, an industrial history, cultural history. And you're very distinctive, in so many ways, which I think I understand a little bit better than before by coming here, is what are the market dynamics? Because we could conceive of many projects along your estuaries, The question is, can those be supported by the public sector exclusively or be a mix of public and private investment. And so the question is, in an area that's with an aging population, can you be a magnet for talent coming from other parts of Europe or from other parts of the world? And can you be a place, and this is an American perspective, so excuse me for it, but it's where businesses can form and feel the ability to grow and produce and innovate. So what was so interesting to me was I always look to see who are the sister cities, even though that's a concept from after the Second World War. You know, President Eisenhower pushed it. Who are your sister cities? You have Buenos Aires, Medellin, Monterrey, and Pittsburgh. Those are, you know, at least 3 of those 4. Buenos Aires is going through some difficulties right now. 3 of those 4 are quite vibrant places and really future-oriented places. And the question is, what does it mean to have those relationships in the 21st century rather than the 20th century? The 20th century, we were all trying to come together after the war. I mean, now we're trying to become a network of trading cities, you know, and a network of cities that can share talent together. So I think you've got a certain kind of economic, again, it's the enterprise city or the enterprise metropolis and the physical metropolis. You've got to do both of these. And you've got to think about projects and initiatives in very concrete terms. But I think migration and talent attraction and company attraction is something to sort through here. And that's a different kind of project than let's build the next Guggenheim. That affects talent migration, actually. It really does, because you put yourself on the map. Any place that did that, from a global perspective, wow, that's a risk. I mean, these architects are sort of crazy, actually, when you look at that. I mean, you know, whatever drugs he was taking, give them to me. I'd like some. But I mean, that's it's a remarkable achievement, all right? And that sent a signal. Bilbao is on the map, you know? So what's your next version of that that's both at the large scale, which tend to be physical projects, maybe along these estuaries, but also at the more intimate scale, the company scale, the talent scale. I mean, I would come here every week just because your food is so amazing, but I'm, you know, I'm a little unusual in that regard. But I think you've got to think about both. You've got to think about, you know, the U.S. migration, we think about migration all the time because we move around so much within the country, and then we get so many people, particularly from Mexico and Latin America, Asia. And I regard all that as unbelievably positive, incredibly positive. It's politically volatile, but from an economic perspective, we're constantly replenishing, you know, our younger population. So you've got to think of both the physical and the enterprise, the personal and the corporate.
And in this talent attraction campaign,
yeah.
Because I don't know if is there any city or region in the world that is not proclaiming now to be an urban living lab for pilot projects and so on. What are the actives, the assets that regions and cities can offer to attract talented people? Because we are a very elderly society. Our birth rate is really low. Immigration is barely coming, but the pandemic has had an effect. And you mentioned food, which is an active, but what else can Metropolitan Bilbao offer to attract these talented people, like the Indian population in Pittsburgh, for instance?
I'll give you an example. I mean, so Tulsa, Oklahoma, you know, which some people may regard as being in the middle of nowhere. Tulsa, Oklahoma started a remote work effort a couple of years ago. And they basically said, and they have a very large philanthropy, the Kaiser Foundation. They basically said to technology workers who were working, this was pre-pandemic, they were working at home. in the San Francisco area or the Boston area or the New York area, and they're spending a lot of their money on housing. They said, move to Tulsa. We'll give you $10,000, and we'll give you a place in a co-working space in the downtown. That's it, right? And so they put this out there, you know, on YouTube or whatever, and LinkedIn, and they thought, okay, maybe we'll get like 1,000 applicants or something, and for 100 positions, right? They got tens of thousands of people basically saying, yeah, I would move to Tulsa for $10,000. I mean, like a really fascinating response. And the interesting part of it was when they made this request for proposals, they said, you know, we're going to give you a community. We're going to put you in the downtown in one of these co-working spaces, and then we're going to connect you to whatever social or environmental issue you care passionately about. You know, I want to mentor children on the weekend, or I want to, you know, clean up the river, you know, or whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But whatever your passion is, we want to basically encourage. So you have all these people who are sitting in their basement somewhere in, you know, metropolitan San Francisco, feeling like, is this all I get? Yes, I'm doing all this interesting technology work, but I could do it from anywhere. I don't need to be in San Francisco. I could do it from Tulsa. And the one thing that they really triggered was this desire to be a part of a community and to, quote unquote, give back. I mean, to do something with your life. So again, you know, you're 350,000 people in the city or 1 million people at the metro. You don't need to attract tens of thousands of people. But let's just say you were able to sort of, you know, work on something like that with both people who live here and people from abroad, you probably would trigger a reaction. Tulsa is a fascinating, it's a different kind of economic development. Very different when you think about it. It's focusing on talent migration, you know, because they don't have a Carnegie Mellon in the same way. They don't have the same kind of advanced research university. So it's had a tremendous effect. And it's also put Tulsa on the map. Everyone just assumes, wow, that was interesting. Anyone who would come up with that kind of idea must be thinking about the future. So it had the effect that your Guggenheim said. You know, it's like, wow, that's different. And now other places are trying to copy it, and, you know, but we'll see. I think Tulsa was first, so they have that first mover advantage on this new idea.
And in terms of public-private cooperation, I know you've mentioned Indianapolis.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about how they managed to engage public, private, and social efforts towards the same direction?
Well, Indianapolis is another one of these 40-year-old stories, because 40 years ago, if you went to downtown Indianapolis, it was literally dead. I mean, there was nothing in downtown Indianapolis. I mean, everyone had left for the suburbs. And the only thing going on over a weekend, literally, were a bunch of guys would come down with their shotguns and shoot at pigeons. I mean, that was literally the only thing happening in Indianapolis. So the city leaders got together, business, university, philanthropy, and the government, and said, this ain't good. We need to restore the core. We need to have a center again. And their idea was to become the amateur sports capital of the United States, which I'm not sure that's the best idea in the world. But in any event, so they just started building stadia for stuff, basketball and, you know, American football and baseball. I mean, you know, whatever sports you could think of, they just started building facilities for. And then they started stealing professional teams from other cities. Like, so it's, I don't know if you've ever heard of the person John Dillinger. He was a famous criminal in the 1930s. So it was like the John Dillinger rule, just steal from everyone and bring it to your city. After about 20 years of that, they said, okay, we've done the best at sports we could do. We're on the map globally for sports. This is not great. I mean, how do we move up the value chain? So they decided to focus on life science because Indiana and central Indiana is a big medical device place. They manufacture medical devices. So they created a corporate philanthropic university collaborative called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. And they decided they would all sit together 4 times a year and bet on life sciences, on companies, on faculty, on workforce, on logistics in an integrated way. So they've been doing that for 20 years, 25 years. They're now the second largest exporter of life science products in the United States after California. It's been an unbelievable success, you know. And what it is a kind of radical collaboration. They meet 4 times a year to decide, not to discuss. So they have a staff that says, here's the changing market dynamics of life sciences. Here's our position. Here's what we need to do. And everyone basically says, absolutely, let's go there, you know? I mean, so, but it took a long time, and they had to go from basketball to biotech. They had to start with sports to start the trust across the different sectors and different leaders, and then move to a more advanced part of the economy. So I will say that sometimes they also made really stupid investments, and they'll say that. And they'll say, well, not everything worked out. So here's an investment that did not work out, but we learned from it. And then that led to this and this and this and this. So again, it's the taking of risk as a collective that's so interesting.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm seeing that there are lots of questions over there. In order to have time to finish, I'm going to...
And by the way, am I being responsive to your questions, or just being too much of an American? I don't know.
Eskerrik asko. A ver si puedo igual juntar algunas de ellas. Bueno, nos dicen aquí, muchas ciudades y metrópolis americanas destacan por su carácter... Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading in Spanish. Okay, you have to use...
Oh, I have to use this, okay.
Or otherwise I can translate.
No, whatever.
Okay, I will read slowly, Marian. Muchas ciudades y metrópolis americanas destacan por su carácter innovador y emprendedor. ¿Cómo podemos incentivarlo en nuestra metrópoli? ¿Qué mecanismos, herramientas destacan en sus ciudades para impulsar la atracción de iniciativas, empresas, emprendedores, innovadores?
I would say that, the U.S. is very innovative, but that's because we've been through decades of the national government and our state governments being unreliable. So what we learned in the United States is, and I'm not sure if you have this phrase, that no one had our back at the local level. You couldn't rely on anyone. And I've worked for Democratic presidents, and I've always said to mayors of the U.S. who tend more likely to be, of central cities who tend to be Democratic, don't think the federal government is going to help you. If they do, it's an accident, you know. So you really need to take control of your own destiny. Once you believe that, and once you believe that the collaboration between these different sectors and different disciplines that is based on real evidence, you know, here's what we're good at. You can't be delusional about this. I mean, there was a period where every part of the U.S. would say, we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. Are you insane? I mean, come on. You're not going to be the next Silicon Valley. You're going to be the best 21st century version of Pittsburgh or Indianapolis. And then that begins to unleash and liberate people to say, well, what could we do? And what Americans like to do in the U.S., it tends to be more domestic, is the business leaders, university leaders, government leaders about 100 people. They all get up, once a year and go to another city. And that's when they begin to percolate ideas. Oh, here's what Houston is doing, or here's what Denver's doing. And then they come back. The most important thing is the bonding that happens on the trip. People begin to spend time with each other, and they're all seeing the same thing together. And they go, why don't we do that? Or do a different version of that back home? And that, in some ways, is the way this innovative practice continues, is this bonding together of stakeholders who have the same experience. I mean, if you're stuck together for 3 days in Houston, you're bound to come up with some ideas, I suppose. So it's a sort of way that we get out. Now, I wish they would come over here, but that's a big trip, to make for 100 people. Actually, a couple of years ago, I told the Denver business leaders, they wanted to know what to do with their transit system and housing. I said, well, don't go anywhere in the US. We don't know what we're doing. Go to Copenhagen. So 100 leaders went to Copenhagen, jet lagged out of their minds, but really bonded and came back, and a whole bunch of new initiatives started because of it. It's an interesting way in which innovation occurs across sectors.
I have a couple of questions. No, don't use it. I will translate them for you. Related to universities.
Yep.
One of them is related to how critical could be a famous college or university in the future of a city. And also, if universities have to think or rethink the way they teach, because sometimes they perhaps use traditional models of teaching.
Yeah, so one thing about universities is, and this is, again, the way we think about the stock that we have of our universities. So we're very critical about what we have in our cities and metropolitan areas. Because, and Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York City, basically said, we have Columbia, we have New York University, but they're really not top engineering or computer science schools. So let's get one of those, and put out a request for proposals, globally, and said, if you come to New York City, we'll give you a campus. We'll just give you the land. And Stanford University in California said, well, that's interesting. We can have an East Coast presence. And then ultimately the winner was Cornell, and then Technion University from Haifa. But that began to say to American cities, we can think about not having whole other universities from another part of the world come to our city, but just a unit where we might collaborate and partner. And then we can expand our assets. So if we're really good in this part of curriculum or whatever, we can expand it. So there's a lot of focus in the US of, well, let's have a collaboration both domestically or globally. And then maybe we'll get 50 students on an annual basis to be moving to the US, and we can build a whole sort of, cluster of activity around them. That's quite common now in the US, thinking about what we would call unanchoring anchor institutions. So I think as you're thinking about your future, obviously this is a great university, but it may not have all the assets or attributes it should have. Where else in the world could you possibly have relations? Maybe it's with your sister cities. Maybe it's with Pittsburgh. Carnegie Mellon or the University of Pittsburgh could have a European presence. Why not, right? So you can begin to think about those. In terms of how you teach students, I'm at Drexel University now part-time. Drexel is a cooperative university, which means when students come in, they spend half their time in companies or nonprofits and half their time in the classroom. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. I can't remember anything I did in university, to tell you the truth. But I was a history major, so it was not even remotely practical. I was just happy to study the stuff I was interested in. But But when I was in high school, I had a cooperative education. For a whole year, I worked for the New York City Council, which was a complete. First of all, it was great not to go to school. That was, at that time, that didn't seem like a great idea. But it was great to work at the age of 16. It was just fantastic to be in the workforce. And it had a big effect on, I became, okay, I'm going to be a city person. I'm going to work around cities. So it had a big effect, So I'm a big believer in cooperative education. Get kids out into the workforce, into city government, metropolitan government, whatever it is, corporations. Yeah.
Great. I have now a couple of questions related to the metropolitan municipalities.
Yep.
One question is related to the future of small villages or cities inside metropolitan areas. And also a question about if we need an entity or an agent that is linking all those spaces together to coordinate efforts and ideas. What's your views on those two subjects?
Well, I think, what you have is a connective tissue here, which is the estuary, the river, the water is your connective tissue, which we don't really have in the U.S. because we're sort of a newer country, and this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years here. So my answer might be the same, actually, that many of your smaller places, if they have this attachment to the waterfront, that may be their raison d'etre, It may be a particular way in which they experience the river that would be of interest to other people in the metropolitan area or from people outside the metropolitan area. This is a great natural, for people who care about hiking, and experiencing nature, this is a remarkable place. Right? So you've got those assets, and you may need to think about how to enhance them, as a marketing strategy. Denver, frankly, did as well as it did because it attracted people that really 20, 30 years ago were beginning to believe I need to work in a city, but I need to have a different experience with nature on the weekend, let's say. You offer that to people here in a major way. I'm not going to be hiking in the mountains, but my daughter might. So, so you might be, sort of attracting a certain segment. The key is to have an overall playbook for this estuary. Right? A set of projects that are more customized to different places that could then add up to a bigger whole, and then you can begin to sort out the financing of it. But you've got some real assets here that could be leveraged. And they're quite different from what Madrid has or Barcelona has or other parts of Spain or other parts of Europe. This is a pretty interesting place, right? From an economic development perspective, the key is to figure out what those assets are. Obviously, there are a few other places that might have them. But when I think about places that have these natural assets, they're usually not around major metropolitan areas. It's like the Lake Country in England or something. You're like a major metro with a lake country. That's pretty damn distinctive, really distinctive. And if you think about the redevelopment of this broader riverfront, that could really that's the next Guggenheim, right? That's the next signal about 21st century economy shaping.
Now that you mentioned these strengths,
Yeah.
They are also asking about weaknesses or weak points that you could perhaps, in these days that you've been with us, are any weak points that we have to consider in this strategic vision?
Well, I think your weak points might be more, a question of, Europe at this stage, because, the U.S. right now is being affected by the Ukrainian war. but not in the same way that Europe is. I mean, I think this is 2022 will be looked at in history this will be like the equivalent of the Berlin Wall falling. I mean, this is a demarcator between one kind of world and another world. And I think because Americans don't get out that much anyway, we're not quite absorbing how big a deal this is a major event, what's happening in the Ukraine. And it's also a major event with what it says for how China is going to deal with the world. So you're part of Europe, and Europe, I think, is going to go through a transition now because of the energy crisis and the political instability that this war is causing. And so in the near term, that's going to have some effects, because you can't suddenly say, well, we're not part of Europe. No, you're part of Europe, right? So, I mean, I think you're going to have to figure out, along with, your Spanish compatriots, how to adjust to this and adapt to this. And so I'm not sure really, and this is why I don't call this the new normal. I don't think this is normal at all, to have a land war in Europe. I mean, 75 years after the end of the Second. This is not normal. This is a disorder, and it's going to take a while to adjust to it. So in terms of, weaknesses, I think what I mostly tend to focus on are strengths. You're a very distinctive place. You're very different than, you're part of Spain, but you're also like a whole different culture, really, the Basque country, and on both sides of the border with France. I would say that that's sort of a major selling point, not for everyone, but you don't need to attract everyone. You need to attract a certain segment of people who are interested in this place, right? And so I think you mostly have strengths, but your primary weakness is what's happening right now, and how it's not the pandemic. The pandemic will have effects. The Ukrainian war has more of a long-standing effect, I think. And I don't think we quite understand yet all that is going to come from this. So,
unfortunately, we will see in the next months what's going on. Next question is related to science.
Yep.
The question says that the American philosophy is more centered in basic science.
Yep.
And in the Basque Country, in the evaluation of the Technology and Science and Innovation Plan, there was a conclusion in which the basic research didn't get to results,
right,
and be translated to applied science. What's your view to solve this lack of connection?
Well, I think we're struggling in the United States, and this may be relevant. We have a lot of basic science investments, and out of our major universities like Stanford or MIT or Georgia Tech or Carnegie Mellon, it results in unbelievable innovation for the market and ultimately for our military. I mean, we need to understand how much in the U.S. is driven by the military. We lack in applied research, and we're struggling to have closer relationships with industrial companies or technology companies and universities around technology problem solving. So we look to Europe, actually, as an example of how to do that. Sheffield has a very powerful relationship between its manufacturing sector and the University of Sheffield. The Danish corporate university relationships are quite strong, as they've been the vanguard of the green economy. And so we're beginning to think about buttressing what has sort of been a national focus since the 1950s in the US, and this is long-standing in the United States, on basic science and expanding that to applied research. And then trying to find the right universities. They're not the MITs. I'm working with a small engineering school about 1,500 students in Flint, Michigan, which was the birthplace of General Motors, one of our auto companies. That's a cooperative university for engineers. We think that that school could be one of a cluster of schools around the country to where industry and the academy and faculty and students could be working closely together. And we also look to Israel for a lot of this as well, because the Israeli universities are much more talent-focused and applied-focused than ours. And so we're now thinking of a shift, but it won't be driven by the national government. It will be driven locally. It will very much bottom-up economy shaping with investments from different sectors. But Europe and Israel are very much on our minds these days. Yeah.
And we've arrived to the last question, but I have a problem. I don't understand one of the words which is written. I don't know whose the question is. It asks about some tips about how new localism can work against growing something in the United States. ¿De quién es esta pregunta? ¿De? Asier. Inequalities, sorry. So tips about new localism against inequalities. Sorry.
No, it's a great question. I think new localism has got to be a counter to rising populism, first and foremost. Because what new localism is problem solving and pragmatic collaboration. Populism in the United States is really about know-nothing and demagoguery and grievance and unfortunately a lot of racist sort of elements. So first, new localism has to be a counter to that. We have to show the country we can do things that benefit the broader populace. Inequality, we have very large racial and ethnic disparities on income, health, and wealth in the US, which got worse during the pandemic, got a lot worse during the pandemic. So part of new localism is about solving for that, right? And so a lot of these investment playbooks are about very disadvantaged parts of our cities and our metros. And they're about helping Black and Latino entrepreneurs grow business, helping Black and Latino workers gain skills, rejuvenating commercial corridors in disadvantaged communities. So, it is about problem solving in the service of reducing inequality. So it gets back to what problems do you want to solve? And inequality, at the end of the day, we should have a national safety net in the United States that's much more robust. It should be the responsibility of our national government to reduce the gap between wages and prices and all that. But cities, in a more intimate way, in metropolitan areas, can solve for inequality around small business and workforce and these geographic areas.
Okay, Bruce, I think, unfortunately, we have reached the final point of your conversation today.
Are you exhausted by this?
But we have to be respectful about the time. And I think I speak on behalf of all the audience when I tell you that it's been a real pleasure and a learning experience to hear you today. And I love one of the sentences you use, think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. Yeah. I think we did that in the past in Metropolitan Bilbao, and we hope we will do it again next time. And thank you so much. Txalo bero bat eskatzen dizuet, berarentzat, mila esker. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks.